Now, with Bitcoin at a 15-month low, I know what the question you're interested in, right? What's the price next week? And what's the price next month? So let me disappoint you up front. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. So what I've been doing lately in a sequence of papers is trying to develop tools that help us make sense of the price. So intuitively speaking, we know that the price should be connected to some fundamentals, the number of users in the network. There are miners, there is hash rate, there are expectations, there is a probability of an attack, potentially. But how exactly do these different moving parts connect to each other? So that's how an economic model can be useful, right? Making sense of those interconnections in some sense of market equilibrium. So there are a lot of details that go into these kind of models. Let me say up front why we need a new model. I think despite the fact that monetary economics and asset pricing are a large body of literature and work, most of the theoretical work has been developed around the idea of a centralized network as opposed to a decentralized network. So what is different in a decentralized network? So let me give you perhaps some perspective telling you about what I think are the main ingredients. And of course, I don't capture in the paper every single aspect. So what are the main ingredients? On the demand side, on the supply side, what do I mean by an equilibrium, and what are some of the implications you might be interested in? So let me start with the fundamental value. Typically in finance, we think about an asset as some kind of state contingent security, right? So we receive something in some state of the world at a given time in the future. Now, that is fine, but if the economy is really living in a network, that's perhaps an incomplete description of the environment. Why? Because in a network, I'm not only concerned about whether I receive some payoff in the future, in some future state of the world, but also whether I can make transfers with others, right? So can I make a transfer to my family in another country in the future? Can I keep operating with my business partner in this country that may be unplugged from the financial sector, internationally speaking, etc.? So in that sense, I think Bitcoin has two clear advantages from a centralized financial design. In a centralized financial design, many nodes, if you want, are left out, are not connected, perhaps because of poor credit history, low income, etc. And even if I'm connected, I want to send the transfer tomorrow. At that point, the node that is running the financial system can say yes or can say no. So let me call that a soft form, the latter a soft form of censorship, right? Stopping the transaction, preventing me from connecting to the network in the first place. That would be a hard form of censorship. So Bitcoin has two advantages. It's peer-to-peer. So anyone is free to connect at any time at virtually no cost and send transfers to everybody in the network. And second, is the degree of censorship resistance is perhaps not perfect, but much greater, right? For two reasons. It's a lot more difficult to map identities from a particular hash to a person. And second, even if this were partially possible, and some verifier in the network, some miner tried to stop the transaction in this particular period, it's quite likely that next period, someone else becomes the miner that wins the block verification reward, and my transaction goes through. So that's the building block of what I'm trying to capture here. So I consider a simple environment. There are miners and there are some users. Users value the ability to make censorship-resistant transactions in the network and live for 2 periods, right? So imagine today and tomorrow. So they also speculate. They also care about the value of the token, of the asset tomorrow, and they base their demand on those 2 components. How useful is the network, right? And what is the expected return if I buy tokens today? On the miner side, there are a number of potential nodes that provide computational resources to secure the network. Now, they don't cooperate with each other. They have the same mining costs. They have similar technology, if you want, for simplicity. And the probability that they win the reward is proportional to the amount of computational resources they provide. Now, although you are familiar with how Bitcoin works, let me highlight one breakthrough characteristic of the system designed by Nakamoto that is very important when it comes to the economics behind, which is the fact that the token that consumers use for transfers, is the same token that incentivizes the provision of resources that secures the network from external attacks in the first place. I call that simultaneous role of the token the unity property. You can call it something else, but that's essentially what I mean. So what is an equilibrium? Well, an equilibrium is a threefold object. So we have consumers are demanding Bitcoins today, trying to maximize expected utility. Miners don't cooperate with each other. They are trying to optimize profits. And the asset market clears, right? So what is that I find? Well, the first implication of equilibrium is that price and hash rate, the system hash rate, are simultaneously determined. So in this environment, for a given level of decentralization, the greater the amount of hash rate, the greater the security of the network. So what I have in mind is there can be a potential attacker, could be a central bank, could be someone else, a firm, etc., some incumbent, has a budget, tries to attack the system, everything else being constant, the greater the system hash rate that is in the hands of honest miners, the less likely that such attack succeeds. So why is it important that price and hash rate are simultaneously determined? It is sometimes argued that mining costs provide some kind of floor to the price. I don't find that to be the case. In fact, we are to some extent observing that in life right now. And second, at the same time, mining costs are not the floor, but at the same time, the hash rate is not passive to the price, in the sense that if the hash rate were sufficiently low, consumers would expect the network to be unsecure, and they are not willing to pay a positive price for the token in the first place, right? Think about what happens to the price of all of the alternative coins that were attacked during 2018. Okay, we have a few examples, Mona Coin, Birch, Bitcoin Gold. The valuation, the market valuation was significantly affected by these attacks. So I look for equilibrium in which, over time, the market capitalization of the network is constant. That's a good starting point. I find that in general there are multiple equilibria. So that's the first source of important volatility. The system can transition from a low value equilibrium to high price equilibrium, or vice versa. I find in general that the high price equilibrium is dynamically unstable, in the sense that if you deviate because of a shock from that equilibrium, you turn not to return endogenously to the same price. The low value equilibrium is more stable. So what happens, for example, if you calibrate the model to the state of the network in July of 2018, when the price was around $6,400? Well, if you consider that to be the high value equilibrium, and you have a negative shock, like what we have observed in between, the market is going to converge at a new level where supply and demand meets. My estimation is perhaps a little bit sad, but it's around $400, right? Now, that is if everything else stays constant. Of course, the moving parts that affect supply and demand can evolve and change their value. So different equilibrium and different stability properties. Now, I find that decentralization matters for the price, even if miners are all honest. Miners are competing in capacity here, right? It's similar to many of the oligopoly problems we analyze in economics. In fact, I can relate it to gold mining. What happens when you compete in capacity, right? Production quantity. If gold miners are investing more resources into mining, the production increases, but the price decreases, right? In Bitcoin, the opposite takes place. The more capacity is provided in the system as a whole, the higher the price of the token in equilibrium. So why is that I find this outcome that is the opposite to what you would expect in a Cournot economy, if you are familiar with the term of that type of imperfect competition? Precisely because there is a structural difference between a traditional oligopoly and Bitcoin mining. Bitcoin miners are not competing in units of Bitcoin, but units of network security. That is hash rate. That is important to make sense of why you find that counterintuitive, perhaps, result. Now, if you increase the security of the network to a limit, that is, if, for example, we are all running a node and we have very high level of security in the network, the price is not going to increase forever. There's going to be an asymptotic limit. So I try to find what that asymptotic limit is. My estimation when I calibrated this back in July was around $10,900. Okay, so it's significantly higher of the market than the market price at the time, but definitely not unbounded or extremely high. What else can you find interesting? Okay, so I find that the economics of supply are quite different from a traditional central banking model of money. In a traditional central banking model of money, if you increase the nominal rate of inflation, the price of money measuring goods is going to decline. Now, in Bitcoin, that can take place, but not necessarily. There are three forces at play. On the one hand, there is a scarcity factor, right? If I print more Bitcoins, if inflation were higher, there is a debasing effect. There is also an expectation effect. If I keep the same rate of inflation at a high level in the future, that has a negative effect on the price as well. But because security is endogenously determined, it's not guaranteed by an institution, but it's the outcome of the market equilibrium. If miners are mainly compensated by units of Bitcoins, right? If I drive that reward to a very low value, consumers are going to react negatively, right? So I find there is an optimal level of inflation in the system in the sense of maximizing market capitalization, which I find interesting. Now, some of you may have a computer science background. One of the arguments that is often argued is that Bitcoin should follow some kind of Metcalfe's law, right, which is what we have in mind for the communication networks. So I try to disentangle what the fundamentals imply for the relation between the number of users and the price. I find that relation to be nonlinear, as in Metcalfe, but it's not necessarily a square relation. Okay? What really drives the connection between users and price are things like risk aversion, mining costs, and the specifics of the network technology. So I cannot give you full details, but I encourage you to look at the paper to find more precision. If some of you are working on empirical models and implementing empirical models, that may provide with some structural way of connecting those two quantities. And finally, we are, of course, all concerned with volatility, right? Volatility is super high in Bitcoin. So I already talked about multiple equilibrium, but the connections of demand and supply generate additional sources of volatility. So when expectations are fixed, if I shock the system, this unity property amplifies volatility. What do I mean by that? If, for example, if you increase the number of users, demand will push the price up. But as the price is pushed up, miners react because they are incentivized by greater economic value, providing more hash rate, and securing the network, which creates an additional wave of positive valuation on the price. So the new fixed point takes place at a price that is significantly higher. And the opposite is true when there is a negative shock. So this endogenous amplification is found in this environment. Now, I also compare the volatility of Bitcoin to that of other tokens. Think about an ERC20 token or repo, for which the network security is not directly connected to the price. Okay? I call because they don't satisfy this unity property, those type of tokens, duality tokens. And what I find is that it is not obvious which of the two systems deliver greater volatility. It crucially depends on how consumers form expectations. In fact, when expectations are formed rationally, which of course may demand quite a bit of intelligence from the point of consumers, what I find is that Bitcoin volatility, everything else being constant, is actually tempered by the unity property. So I hope I was a little bit excited to take a look at the model and perhaps try to answer some of the questions you have in mind with this work. Thank you very much.